What are some of the craziest long drives you have done? I have an American friend, albeit probably an irregular, who will regularly drive 13 hours on a Friday, cave dive for Saturday, Sunday, and then drive 13 hours back on Sunday night into Monday. Him describing it just breaks my brain. What are some of the craziest long drives you've done straight through? And how did you do it without collapsing at the wheel? One time, I drove from North Carolina to see my girlfriend in New Jersey, 10 hours and change, for a weekend. She elected to end the relationship. It was important that this be done in person, apparently, and I wasn't interested in sticking around for a recovery nap. So I drove back that night/morning. So about 21 hours of driving, a little less than 1,100 miles, in a 23-hour span. This meeting could have been an email. Dang. I get the do-it-in-person idea, but not if it involves making you drive 10 hours to do it, 20 HRS because he had to drive back too. The anger I would have felt, I'd send an invoice for the gas, LOL Cash App request. That's really shitty to make your BFGF drive all day to see you, only to tell them it's over when they get there. Agreed. I broke up with a girl after a couple months in person, and she had to drive about 40 minutes each way, if that, and was annoyed, so I can't imagine being this guy. Yet another meeting that could have been an email. I went to see my college girlfriend who graduated before me in Puerto Rico, and she broke up with me within 2 hours of arrival. Said she didn't want to do it over the phone. I asked her if she knew how much a flight from Chicago costs. Would have been great to save me that money as a college student. Maybe she was hoping she would feel differently when she saw you in person. I don't know. Relationships can make people weird. My brother and his friends would do the same trip for surfing in the Outer Banks. I drove 16 hours from Metro Detroit to Springfield, Missouri about a decade ago as part of a 3-day trip to Arizona. I stopped for bathroom breaks, gas, and food, but otherwise it was a straight shot. One of the worst decisions of my adult life. I've never felt as exhausted as I did that night. I've done plenty of 12-hour single-day drives. Those aren't fun, but they're nowhere near as bad as that 16-hour drive I did. I did a similar length drive from Dayton, OH to Tilton, New Hampshire for work. I drove instead of flying because I got paid mileage and made about $800 in mileage reimbursement, but it was a rough 16 HR drive both ways. I did Detroit to Phoenix twice, 2,000 miles. I moved there for work. The first time only stopping in Amarillo, Texas for a 30-minute nap. The second time with a 24-foot box truck, no stopping for sleep, no co-pilot on the first trip, friends following in another vehicle on the second. When I moved from SoCal back to Michigan, 2,400 miles, I had a 21-foot box truck with a flatbed trailer and my van on it. That trip I broke up into 3 days, having learned my lesson from the aforementioned. Co-pilot included this time. In 2006, my brother and I drove from Anchorage, Alaska to Illinois in 5 days. It took about 2 days to drive through the Yukon Territory and British Columbia, Canada. For anyone curious, to Chicago, who cares where they went in IL honestly, like it would make a difference, is 3,557 miles. And Google has it pegged at 58 hours of driving. 5 days is 120 hours, so they drove for 12-plus hours a day for 5 days straight. OP, you and your brother are madmen. One of my friends did that drive in reverse, roughly. I think it took him 2 weeks. Going in reverse sounds dangerous. Also cause neck strain. Also illegal. Do not recommend. Helped a friend move from Orlando to Grand Rapids, Michigan. We did it in a day. Sort of. It's about 20 hours of driving. We took turns driving and sleeping, but mostly just up the whole time chatting to keep each other awake. I remember it was around Valentine's Day because we had a huge bag of those little heart-shaped candies they sell with the cheesy sayings on them. We basically had them on the dash and just shoved a bunch in our mouth and drank some coffee to wash them down. Pretty much lived on sugar coffee and whatever weird gas station food we could find. 28 HR's Denver, New England. 2 HR nap at hour 20 in a rest stop somewhere. I like driving and don't really have much trouble keeping myself awake, especially now that music streaming services exist. Obviously, driving for that long gets fairly miserable, but it wasn't that bad. Really, the worst thing is the rural Great Plains. Half a day of cornfields and the occasional small town with almost nothing else for scenery is much more boring than basically anywhere else I've driven through. I've done road trips out west, and the plains are the area that I've enjoyed the most. It's nothing like what we have in northern New England. It still feels like you're in the frontier. It still feels like you're in the frontier. That's what the rural southwest/desert/mountains feels like to me, wild and empty. Endless farm fields don't feel all that frontier to me. It's highly developed, just with all the same thing, and not with many people. My brother does that every year back and forth, goes out to Colorado for the winter and back to Maine for the summer. When I bought my truck, I flew out to Pennsylvania to get it because it was $8,000 cheaper than local options. My sister was graduating nursing school 3 days later, so I drove back in 2 days. It was rough, and I wouldn't want to do it again. Imagine doing all the way to find out the truck is absolute garbage LOL. That would drive me crazy. My buddy did something similar, but not as far. Flew from MPLs to Bismarck just to find out the truck had hidden rust all over LOL. My buddy did something similar, but not as far. Flew from MPLs to Bismarck just to find out the truck had hidden rust all over LOL. In his defense, I say regularly, as once every 2 months or so. When I was in grad school, I'd drive from Ithaca, New York down to Kentucky, and then back up every couple of months. I think it amounted to about 25, 31-way trips across the 3-year degree I got. All in, that amounts to 10. 13 hours one way, depending on the day and the amount of traffic you hit. Nice thing about the U.S. highway system is you're really driving in a straight line for most of it, no matter where you are. I get some snacks and coffee and some good music, podcasts, and settle in. Thrown on cruise control and rest in the non-passing lane, and you're pretty much golden. Just can't fall asleep and can't run out of gas. It was only ever really dangerous once I hit the Appalachian area of the trip, which on the way to Kentucky usually came by nighttime. Isolated hills, mountains, and winding roads with sparse traffic, and usually no lighting at all. I almost ran out of gas there once in the mountains, somewhere in Maryland or West Virginia, and rolled into a gas station at 2 a.m. on an empty tank with a range of 0 miles left. It was all actually pretty enjoyable usually. Longest drive I ever did was from NYC to Houston, Texas, which was a full 24 hours worth of driving and over 1,600 miles. I wouldn't ever go more than 14 hours at a time, though. It gets to the point where pretty much anyone would get groggy, and then you become a liability. I did that drive from West Virginia to D.C., and that West Virginia-Maryland stretch of road had got nothing, absolutely nothing. I, too, was terrified I would run out of gas, and I'm Latino and the guy I was driving with black, so when we pulled into the one gas station, I wouldn't say they were hostile. But everyone turned around and stared at us, probably just wondering what you were all about. I'm from that part of the country. There's some odd people about, but all in all, I think it's mainly just that they're used to seeing the same people every day. Appalachia is a pretty unique place with a pretty unique history as far as the U.S. goes. They are kind of floating in space in a lot of ways over there. My family was actually mixed race back in the day while living there, known as Melungeons. Yeah, I know I've lived in West Virginia for about 30 years, but trust me, there's a lot of racism. And oddly enough, I see it more in northern West Virginia than southern West Virginia. Yeah, the southern bit of West Virginia, eastern Kentucky, northeastern Tennessee, and northwestern North Carolina are kind of interesting historically. They were mostly historically Unionist during the Civil War and were largely anti-slavery and didn't have a geography suitable for plantation culture. In the Jim Crow era, local state governments would try to get them to enforce one-drop rules to classify people as black if they had any African ancestry, my dad's family included. But it was pretty poorly enforced there. My family pretty much embedded itself in a community that was overwhelmingly white, but made out of it okay, and some even held positions like county sheriff, etc. It's just a strange place that isn't quite like anywhere else. Funny, I see that we've both also done the Houston to New York City drive. It took us a lot longer, but that was because it was before increased state speeds and there was a blinding snowstorm when we drove through Pennsylvania and we hit New York City at 7 a.m. on a weekday, so nothing like driving for hours and thinking you've got to your destination, then having to sit in about 2 hours or more of traffic. I took a Grapes of Wrath roadie from OKC to San Diego this summer. Took 2 days, 20 HRs total. Saw the Painted Desert, Grand Canyon. It was bangarang. Wow. Great theme for a trip. That type of thing is unusual. I've certainly done it for a sporting event or a holiday or something, but not regularly. Most miles I've done in one day was 1,200 plus. Driving a few hours for a weekend getaway or even as a day trip is pretty common. Longest road trip I've done was over 6K miles. When I was 18 in 2006, I drove from Georgia to the Grand Canyon pretty much nonstop. We took turns driving, but I kept waking up sweating in the car parked in the middle of the desert with my GF asleep in the driver's side. It took 4 or 5 days. About 10 years ago, my boss and I scheduled a meeting with a customer in West Virginia. I met him at our office in New Jersey at 5 a.m., and we drove straight there, stopping for gas once. Had our meeting around 10:30 a.m. I was back home in Jersey just in time for dinner. Virginia to Florida is anywhere from 16 hours depending on what part you're coming from and going to. I moved from Charlotte to Seattle and made it in 2.5 days, with 2 dogs and a cat with me. I broke a speed limit or two, but I really enjoyed the trip. Miami to Boston in a straight shot with the exception of a 4-HR hospital detour, when I had an allergic reaction to something still unknown in the middle of NC. Did 4,400 miles over 8 days visiting national parks out west. We drive NCCO a few times a year. It's 2 long days of 12-14 HRs each. We've done it with kids and dog. When we were younger, we used to drive Denver to Seattle in 1 day every year to see family. Usually it's about 20 hours, but one time it was 26 hours thanks to a blizzard. That's pretty extreme even for American standards. I've driven 13 hours before, but to stay somewhere for a whole week. We also drove all the way down the West Coast, Seattle to LA, about 2,000 kilometers, over the course of 8 days, as a vacation. That's about as much as I've done. In 1988, I drove from the Indianapolis area to Phoenix, Arizona, about 1,700 miles. Non-stop except for gas and food. It took about 30 hours because a big snowstorm slowed us down in Flagstaff. My wife and kids slept on and off most of the way. Before the do-gooders warned this was dangerous, I had just finished working 2 jobs from 7 a.m. to 11 p.m. every day for 6 years, and routinely stayed up without sleeping for 36 to 40 hours. No drugs, just a little coffee now and again. A friend and I drove straight from Chicago to Virginia Beach. Think it took us 18 hours with stops and traffic. Made the return drive again 2 days later. That trip almost destroyed our friendship. The longest drive I've done is a straight-through 1-day drive is from Lexington, Kentucky to St. Paul, Minnesota, and back last spring. Including stops for fuel and food, and getting stuck in Chicago traffic along the way, it was about 14 hours each way. In terms of long road trips, back in 2002, I helped a friend move from Sunapee, New Hampshire to Lexington, Kentucky. And that was 3 people in an SUV taking turns as we drove up there, picked her up and loaded her stuff in the SUV, and rented a trailer and loaded her stuff into the trailer, and drove back. We stopped at a hotel in Albany, New York on the way up and in Erie, Pennsylvania on the way down to sleep, and took regular breaks for food and fuel. I don't remember how many hours we're driving, but I remember we left on Friday morning and got back on Sunday evening.